Hello, everyone. This is the 187th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I welcome back Brazilian journalist Mr. José Inácio Werneck as we discuss the Brazil national team during the 1978 World Cup. Mr. Werneck is a journalist, lawyer, interpreter, translator, writer, and a triathlete. Welcome back, José Inácio.
Hello, Sean. How are you?
Thank you. So let's go back in time. Last time we left off following the disappointment of the 1974 World Cup. What were the state of the affairs and changes in Brazilian football since, in terms of football culture and sociologically?
Well, in terms of football culture, the great transformation or change was the arrival of an army officer, Cláudio Coutinho, was coach of the Brazilian team. He had started in 1970 as a physical trainer, then became supervisor. He was well known in Brazil for having done a course in the United States with the famous American physician. I think he was basically Cooper, Kenneth Cooper. And he had adopted the so-called Cooper method of physical preparation. It was not really a method of physical preparation. It was a method of assessing the physical fitness of players. He would make them run 12 minutes and find out what distance they have covered, and then he would elaborate on what the physical fitness level was. Anyway, he also, from that point on, became interested in knowing more about the tactical side of football. And he was well known in a kind of a derisive way in the British press by having been very impressed by a book published in England called Soccer Coaching the Modern Way by Eric Batty. And then he developed all these ideas about overlapping and things like that that he brought into the Brazilian team. In Brazil, many people suspected he was a kind of a charlatan in a way, but he was a keen student of football, and maybe because he was an army officer. And Brazil at that time was under a military dictatorship. The head of the Brazilian Federation was an admiral from the Navy. And so it kind of became a bit logical that an army officer would succeed the former coach, Oswaldo Brandão, who was not doing very well in the job. And so that's how Coutinho, Cláudio Coutinho, became the coach for Brazil for the 1978 World Cup.
We have to start off with Pele. In all our previous podcasts, we charted the level of his fame in the world from tournament to tournament. This was the first tournament, the first World Cup following Pele's retirement in 1977. And he would be a commentator in this particular World Cup. What was his general outlook of Brazilian football at this point?
He was not very keen on Cláudio Coutinho. I remember there was an interview or an article rather that Pelé wrote for the Argentinian newspaper Clarín, in which he criticized Coutinho's tactics. But he said that anyway, he believed that even though he didn't really agree with Coutinho, he believed that Brazil would be one of the finalists, one of the four teams reaching the semifinals for the World Cup final. And he said that it would be Brazil, Italy, Argentina, and West Germany. So he only missed the Netherlands because the Netherlands was the team that made the final against Argentina.
Getting back to Coutinho, like you said, in fact, there were allegations that it was the military that was keeping him in the job. And in fact, his administrative staff were all military men. I read in the World Soccer of back in those days that in fact there were speculations that Mario Zagallo might be reappointed. Do you remember any such debate regarding that?
Yeah, there was some kind of debate, but not really a lot of debate about that. I think Claudio Coutinho, after he took Brazil to an European tour in April, And they beat West Germany at that point. They drew with England. They lost to France, but they played reasonably well. I think his position was quite firm. Zagallo was in the background criticizing him, but not too much. I don't think there was really any danger that he would lose his job, because at that point we were very near the World Cup. There would not be much time to replace him with another coach.
Was it perceived that Coutinho was continuing the Europeanization of Brazilian football that had started in 1974 under Zagallo?
Yes, oh yeah, he was a great believer. All the what so-called modern European tactics. He thought it was a time that Brazil had to start relying less on individual players, brilliant players like Pelé himself, Gerson, Rivellino, players, that practiced what it was called the jogo bonito, the beautiful game, and had to rely more on the tactical approach. The problem was his tactical approach the right one for Brazil or not? Because the truth of the matter is that there was a great confusion about the way Brazil was going to play. In the end, nobody knew for sure, because Coutinho kind of changed his mind several times, including the players. Some players he thought were not doing the job he wanted them to do. For instance, he left out maybe one of the most gifted Brazilian players of all time, Falcão, apparently because he didn't believe that Falcão would play according to his Coutinho's ideas, his tactics. And he took a player like Chicão, who was a physical player and not anywhere near as brilliant as Falcão was. So there was a lot of confusion, controversy and confusion. That is the truth of the matter about that team that Brazil took to the 1978 World Cup.
So would you say more or less his choice of the players that he took reflected his general tactics?
Yeah. He was trying to adapt the players to his tactics. Not always he was very successful. For instance, I'll give you one example. He wanted Reinaldo from Atlético Mineiro, who was a very gifted player, but Reinaldo had lots of physical problems. And in the end, during the World Cup, what happened is that the president of the Brazilian Federation, Admiral Heleno Nunes, I quoted him before, he told Coutinho to drop Reinaldo, to drop Zico. He didn't want them in the team. He wanted players like Roberto, known as Dynamite, because he had a very powerful shot. Anyway, he ordered Coutinho to basically change his approach, and that was in the game versus Austria, because Brazil started drawing with Sweden. That was a very controversial last-minute goal by Zico that was disallowed by the Welsh referee Clive Thomas, if I remember well. And the next game, Brazil drew 0-0 with Spain. So at that point, Admiral Heleno Nunes went to Coutinho and said, drop Zico, drop Reinaldo, let's play Roberto. And he had to change the team. And Brazil won, beat Austria 1-0, a goal scored by Roberto, the so-called Roberto Dinamite, or Bob Dynamite, as he was known in the English press. Jorge Mendonça, he said Coutinho had to play Roberto and Jorge Mendonça, and Coutinho obeyed him.
And Coutinho openly stated that physical strength was required to match the European teams, as there was a fear that the Brazilians would not match the European stamina. Do you remember a radio interview he did with the Argentinian Juan Jose Lopez ahead of the World Cup?
No, I don't know about this interview.
Anyway, in that interview, Juan Lopez told Coutinho that he admired him when he was a teammate of Pele at Santos. And he had to correct him that that was a different Coutinho.
Of course, it was the famous, Coutinho and Pelé, the strikers from Santos. He thought Claudio Coutinho was that Coutinho.
Yeah.
Totally different kind of people.
Yeah.
Anyway, I didn't know about this interview.
Brazil's World Cup qualification had actually been achieved like almost a year before under Osvaldo Brandão. I guess it had been relatively comfortable. That included a 6-0 win over Colombia. What was the takeaway of that particular team under Brandao compared to Coutinho?
Brodon was first chosen to be the coach apparently because he had had a successful spell as coach in Argentina, and Admiral Nunes thought he could do the job well. But Brazil, even though Brazil beat Colombia in that game 6-0, as you said, at that time, Colombian football was much less advanced than it is today, for instance. So it was not really a great way of assessing the qualities of the team. The team was not playing well, and there was a lot of criticism in the press, including by me at the time. And then eventually Claudio Coutinho was made the coach because based on all his so-called modern ideas about playing the European way of football.
And I would like to correct myself. I said that the qualifiers were under Brandao. I should say the qualifiers started with
It
Brandao,
started
but
with
then
Brandão.
but then Coutinho took over from that
Yeah,
famous
yeah,
Colombia
because
match
there
and
was
6-0.
criticism of
Right.
Osvaldo Brandão, right?
And of course, they went on, they even beat Bolivia 8-0 in the final round. And the
Yeah,
only
Bolivia
rival was
also at
Peru.
that time was much less technically, a much lower level than it is today.
There had been the emergence of Flamengo's Zico, who was referred to as the White Pele.
Yeah.
What was his status at that time?
No, Zico was always considered that time a very good player. I don't think there was anybody who was disputing his presence as a first choice for Brazil. And the European tour also showed that he was technically gifted. He was an important player. The problem is that Brazil didn't start well. We started with 2 draws and there was a lot of pressure. And Admiral Nunes said, no, let's drop Zico and let's drop Reinaldo. They are not the kind of players that can play against European teams. It was an intervention. That is the truth of the matter. The Admiral, the head of the Brazilian Federation at that time, intervened in the Brazilian team and forced Coutinho to change the team and to drop Zico and to drop Reinaldo. The fact is that Brazil qualified beating Austria. Zico eventually would return to the team, and Reinaldo, if I remember well, returned to the team in the last game that Brazil played against Italy. It was for the 3rd place game that Brazil eventually won.
Can you describe Coutinho's physical preparation of the team in the months ahead of the World Cup?
Well, I cannot describe it as such because Brazil was playing in, preparing, training in a resort known as Granja Comari in the town of Teresópolis in the mountains near Rio de Janeiro. And some of the training was actually secret. He wouldn't allow the press to watch it. But everybody knew that the emphasis was on stamina for the players to be physically strong and at the same time have the energy to last 90 minutes of the game, because they thought at that time that the World Cup being played in Argentina under lower temperatures because it was the beginning of the winter in the southern hemispheres, that the Europeans would be able to enforce their physical approach. And Coutinho wanted the Brazilian players to be able to stand up to that.
Thanks to the brilliant World Soccer magazine of the day, I learned that upon learning that Brazil would be in the cold Mar del Plata area, he said he would train the team on muddy pitches. Like you said, the training camp was at Teresópolis, which had rainy conditions. If there was no rain, the fields would be watered. Even the friendlies would be in cold areas to prepare the team. He had said that he wanted a team with fighting spirit and not just skill.
The last game that Brazil played in preparation for the World Cup was in Porto Alegre, in the south of Brazil, on the way to Argentina, because they thought that at that time the temperatures in Porto, there was a lot of fear about cold weather in Argentina. In fact, it was not all that cold in Argentina. It was not even still winter. It was end of autumn, end of fall, nearing the beginning of the winter. The World Cup final actually was played on the first day of winter in Argentina. So Brazil really was there at the end of the fall. The temperatures were not all that cold. What was very bad for Brazil is that in Mar del Plata, the pitch was horrendous. I don't know exactly what happened during the preparation of the pitch for the World Cup in the Mar del Plata Stadium, but tufts of the grass would come off as the players would kick the ball. It was absolutely horrible. The conditions were very bad. It was almost impossible to play good football on that pitch in Mar del Plata.
Apparently, there was an attempt to switch venues to Mendoza, but only Mar del Plata had the required hotel accommodations.
Yeah, it is
Yeah.
true. Yeah. Well,
And
eventually Brazil played in other places, like they played in Mendoza, they played in Rosario, and eventually in Buenos Aires.
before the World Cup, Coutinho called off two friendlies, like Copa Roca matches against Argentina, because he only wanted to play at World Cup stadiums. And Argentina said they were not ready and could only play at La Bombonera.
Yeah.
For the first time, it seems Brazil had to worry about the presence of foreign based players. There were ongoing discussions whether Atletico Madrid's sweeper Luis Pereira would be included or released in time.
There was a lot of controversy. Lots of people didn't want to miss Pereira. Eventually, Brazil played a friendly against Atletico Madrid in Madrid to assess the fitness level of Luis Pereira, who was playing for Atletico Madrid. And in the end, he was not called for Brazil. There were lots of people who were against him in the team, and people
Yeah.
said many of the players didn't want Luis Pereira in the team.
Yeah, Leivinha was also at Atletico Madrid around this time, right? I believe.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, so he was,
Livinha,
yeah.
who had played for Brazil in 1974 in the World Cup.
Like we mentioned earlier, there were other discarded players such as Paulo Cesar Caju and Fluminense's Francisco Marinho. And apparently, Pele was critical of Marinho's exclusions. Do you remember these type of discussions?
Marinho was also a controversial player. You remember that in the third place match in 1974, he was blamed for the Lato goal for Poland that eventually won the game. Brazil lost to Poland 1-0 in that game. And Marinho was blamed because he used to go forward a lot. That was one of the other things that Coutinho tried to introduce in the Brazil team at that time was the idea of overlapping. The fullback would go forward and the right winger would drop back. And the fact is that in 1974, you only had half of that idea because Marinho was going forward and nobody was dropping back to cover for him. So Marinho was a very controversial president. And Paulo César has always been all his life a very controversial player, technically gifted, but a player that always created problems wherever he went. That's the truth.
Brazil started its preparations with a series of friendlies against regional teams in March and then embarked on a tour of Europe, like you mentioned earlier. They lost to France on April 1st. A few days later, April 5th, they defeated West Germany. Then they played against Inter, Italian side, followed by a friendly at Wembley against England that ended as
Yeah,
a 1-1
in the
tie.
meantime, before they played against the Inter Milan side in Italy, they had a game in Saudi Arabia, but
Oh,
it
yes,
was
against Al
yeah,
Ahly.
but it
Yes,
was not
yes.
a report. Brazil won that game 6-0.
Right.
It was just
Yeah,
for
6-1.
economic
Yeah, that's
reasons. I
true.
believe the Brazilian Federation wanted money from Saudi
Mhm.
Arabia.
2 days after the England match, they played against Atletico Madrid.
Yeah,
And then in May, they returned to home base and they had friendlies in May against Peru, which they defeated 3-0. Czechoslovakia, they defeated 2-0.
yeah. The game against Czechoslovakia was on May 17,
Yes.
1978. Brazil won that game 2-0.
There was a report that Coutinho had asked his midfielders one by one if anyone would like to play like the famous Zagallo left wing role, and even asked Rivellino if he would like to play like in 1970 as a midfield side and not a central figure in midfield, and he refused.
I don't specifically remember him asking that, but Rivellino was not very keen on the idea of playing on the left side. He wanted to play in midfield, but more centrally than on the left side.
Let's look at the final 22 selected for this World Cup. Number one, starting goalkeeper we have Emerson Leao of Palmeiras.
Yeah.
Number 2 in defense, Toninho of Flamengo. Number 3, Oscar of Ponte Preta. Number 4 in defense, Amaral of Corinthians. Number 5, Toninho Cerezo of Atletico Mineiro. Number 6 in defense, Edinho of Fluminense.
That was
Number
a very controversial choice because he was really a central back, and Coutinho wanted to play him as a left fullback.
Up front, number 7, Zé Sergio of Sao Paulo.
Who was Rivellino's cousin.
Number 8, Zico of Flamengo. Number 9, Reinaldo of Atletico Mineiro, striker.
Yeah.
Number 10, the initial captain of the team, Rivellino of Fluminense. And we will get to how then he would be sidelined and Leao would be the captain for the remainder of the tournament.
Yeah.
Number 11, Dirceu of Vasco da Gama. Number 12, backup goalkeeper, Carlos of Ponte Preta, who would have a long career with Brazil. Not always as a starter, but into the 90s, he would still be playing for the national team. Number 13, Nelinho of Cruzeiro in defense. Number 14, Abel of Vasco da Gama in defense, who I believe later managed Olympique Marseille for a short time.
Yes.
Yeah. And also played for Paris Saint-Germain, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, and coached several teams in Brazil, club teams.
Number 15 in defense, Polozzi of Ponte Preta. Number 16 in defense, Rodriguez Neto of Botafogo. Number 17, Batista of Internacional Porto Alegre, the man who would famously be kicked by Maradona in the 1982 World Cup. Number 18 up front, Gil of Botafogo. Number 19 in midfield, Jorge Mendonça of Palmeiras.
Yes.
Number 20, Roberto Dinamite of Vasco da Gama. Number 21 in midfield, Chicao of Sao Paulo. And third goalkeeper, number 22, Valdir Perez of Sao Paulo from the 1982 World Cup fame.
You mentioned Nelinho. Nelinho, for instance, was called to replace Zé Maria. Zé Maria was one of the players who eventually were cut from the World Cup because of physical fitness. And who was the other player? There were two players that were cut in the last day after that game against Czechoslovakia. I can't remember the name of the other player, but Nelinho.
I remember Tarciso of Grêmio was cut. Nunes of Santa Cruz.
Nunes. Yeah, Nunes was cut eventually. Yeah, in the last day after that game versus Czechoslovakia on May 17th, Nunes and Zé Maria were cut from the team. I was talking about Admiral Heleno Nunes imposing on Cláudio Coutinho in the game versus Austria to replace Zico, to replace Reinaldo, and he also imposed on Coutinho to replace Edinho by Rodrigues Neto, because that was another controversial choice, Edinho playing as a left fullback, because he was not really a left fullback. So Admiral Heleno Nunes ordered Cláudio Coutinho to play Rodrigues Neto.
So all in all, there were 9 players from Rio, 9 players from Sao Paulo, 3 players from Minas Gerais, and 1 from Rio Grande do Sul. From this group, Emerson Leao and Rivellino were also present in the 1970 and 1974 teams, and Nelinho, Dirceu, and Valdir Perez were also present in 1974. We already discussed some of the absentees. Were there any notable ones that we still haven't discussed?
I think the most notable one, no, we haven't discussed him, Luis Pereira. Falcão. We also mentioned Falcão, yeah, a very gifted player, and Coutinho went with Chicão instead.
And apparently Zagallo had declared that he definitely would have taken Luis Pereira, Marinho, and Paulo Cesar Caju.
Yeah, but at that point, it was just his opinion. He was not going to change Cláudio Coutinho's opinion and Admiral Heleno Nunes' opinion.
As the World Cup was being played in South America, were there expectations from the Brazilian press that Brazil has to win?
Not a lot at that time, because at that time the Brazilian press was not very confident on the team. There was a lot of expectation of problems because, the great rivalry between Brazil and Argentina. And what is very important to mention, that World Cup was played in a very strange, negative atmosphere, because at that time in Brazil, in Argentina, in Uruguay, in South America, there were lots of dictatorships. Argentina was under a ferocious dictatorship. Brazil was under a military dictatorship. The same with Uruguay, the same with Chile, with Pinochet. And there has been a lot of talk about the influence of politics in that World Cup. Famously, Claudio Coutinho has claimed that Brazil was the moral champion of that World Cup because of that incident in the game Argentina versus Peru, because up until today, this is very much discussed. Why did FIFA schedule the Brazil versus Poland game for the afternoon and the Argentina versus Peru game for the evening if the games were codependent? They were dependent on each other. The result would qualify, the sum of the result of these two games would define who would go to the final, who would not go to the final. Brazil beat Poland 3-1 in the afternoon, and then Brazil had to watch Argentina beat Peru 6-0 in the evening in Rosario. The other day I was reading a very interesting story in The Guardian from England by Jonathan Wilson about a strange visit that Henry Kissinger made to the Peruvian dressing room, the locker room, before the game versus Argentina in Rosario, in the company of Jorge Rafael Videla, the dictator of Argentina, in which they kind of said to the Peruvian players, the crowd out there will not be happy if Argentina loses and doesn't qualify for the World Cup. There was a lot of controversy about that game, whether it was a political decision or it was just a sports decision. The fact is that Henry Kissinger was also a character, important character in that, and he was in Argentina at the invitation of the Argentinian government. The fact is that this has left a shadow on this World Cup in 1978.
Ahead of the World Cup, where were you in life and how did you observe this World Cup as a spectator and professionally?
Yeah, I was a columnist for Jornal do Brasil at that time. So that was my job. I had been with the Brazil team in the tour of Europe. I even went to the game in Jeddah, in Saudi Arabia. That was my job.
Let's look at the World Cup and the first match against Sweden on June 3rd at Mar del Plata. Brazil were in Group C with Sweden, Spain, and Austria. For this first match against Sweden, we have the following lineup: Leao, Toninho, Oscar, Amaral, Edinho, Cerezo. He'd be replaced by Dircio in the 80th minute. Batista, Rivellino, the captain of the team. Gil, he'd be replaced by Nelinho in the 68th minute. Reinaldo and Zico. Sweden takes the lead in the 37th minute through Thomas Sjöberg. But just before halftime in the 45th minute, Cerezo's cross from the right side was controlled and then struck by Reinaldo. So the match is tied at 1-1. The incident you mentioned earlier, last minute, Brazil are awarded a corner kick. And as the ball was mid-air, the Welsh referee, Clive Thomas, blew the whistle even though Zico had scored and the goal was called off. Brazil submitted an official protest regarding Clive Thomas's refereeing and the premature ending of the match. And of course, the protest was rejected. However, Clive Thomas did not referee another match after this incident. The match ended as a 1-1 tie. Brazil had been disappointing. Pele was famous for saying that you could complain about that last minute incident, but what about the previous 89 minutes?
Okay, but that was the strangest incident I have ever seen in a World Cup game.
Right,
Because
or any game. I don't think I've ever witnessed something like that.
yeah, and Clive Thomas, as you said, never again refereed not just that World Cup, but never again refereed any World Cup game. Because what happened is that Nelinho would always take the corner kick with a swerve kick And he was trying to put the ball exactly where he wanted for that kind with the outside of his right foot. And he kept pulling the ball one place, and the linesman would go there and move the ball. Then he would move the ball back to where he wanted it. The lineman would go there and move the ball to where the lineman thought the ball had to be. And Clive Thomas apparently told the Swedish players the game is going to be over when he takes the corner kick, because he thought the Lee was just wasting time. So the Swedish players knew that the game was going to be over, and he blew the whistle, and the Zico scored. Zico was unchallenged. Now, whether Brazil would have scored had it been a normal corner kick, and the Swedish players knew that Zico could score and were marking Zico, I don't know. But it was very strange. But it doesn't absolve Brazil from the fact that Brazil never played well in that game.
4 days later, it was more of the same, again at Mar del Plata on June 7th against Spain.
Spain could have won that game. There was a Spanish player, I don't remember his name. He took so long to kick the ball into an empty net that Amaral eventually saved for Brazil.
For this match, we have the following lineup. Leao, this time, he's the captain of a team as Rivellino has been dropped. We have Nelinho, he'd be replaced by Gil in the 69th minute. Oscar, Amaral, Edinho, Toninho Cerezo, Batista, Toninho, Zico, he'd be replaced by Jorge Mendonça in the 83rd minute. Reinaldo and Dirceu. This match ended as a scoreless tie. Again, disappointing for Brazil. There was an incident in the 28th minute when Edinho's cross was headed by the Spanish player Olmo into his own post. And I think that's the closest Brazil might have gotten. But
Yeah.
all in all, they were disappointing in this match. There were rumors within the Brazilian camp that you already mentioned, the Brazilian Sports Authority, the Admiral Helenio Nunes. He had taken control of team selection from Coutinho, and that Coutinho had offered to resign but was refused. What is the truth?
I don't know whether Coutinho offered to resign or not, but the truth is that he was ordered to drop Zico and Reinaldo and Edinho, and he did. And Brazil won the game 1-0, a goal scored by Roberto Dinamite, or Bob Dynamite.
For this match against Austria that you mentioned earlier on June 11th, again at Mar del Plata, the team had been remodeled after, like you said, after Coutinho had been ordered to make changes. For this match, we have Leao in goal, captain of the team, Toninho, Oscar, Amaral, Rodriguez Neto, Batista, Toninho Cerezo. He'd be replaced by Chicao in the 71st minute. Gil, Jorge Mendonça, he'd be replaced by Zico in the 84th minute. Roberto Dinamite and Dirceu. And Brazil would win this match 1-0. Roberto Dinamite scored in the 40th minute. From the right side near the touchline, Gil sent a long cross in the box. Roberto Dinamite stopped the ball and shot past Concilia. And Brazil had qualified to the next round, the final group round. In this final group round, in the Group B, Brazil are with hosts Argentina, Peru, and Poland. The first match is on June 14th. This time they're at Mendoza. They're at Mendoza against Peru on June 14th.
And Brazil finally got rid of the dreadful pitch on the Mar del Plata.
For this match, we have the following lineup. Leao, captain of the team, Toninho, Oscar Amaral, Rodriguez Neto, Batista, Toninho Cerezo, he'd be replaced by Chicao in the 76th minute. Gil, he'd be replaced by Zico in the 70th minute. Jorge Mendonça, Roberto Dinamite, and Dirceu. Dirceu opened the scoring from a free kick in the 15th minute. He scored a second goal as well in the 28th minute with a long-range shot from the outside of the box from the left side. In the 73rd minute, Roberto Dinamite was fouled in the box, and Zico insisted on scoring from the penalty kick, and he did. Brazil won 3-0. Then, a few days later, on June 18th, they played the hosts, Argentina, at Rosario. And this is the Argentina team that would win the World Cup eventually with all the stars that we know. Kempes, Passarella, Luque, Ardiles, Ubaldo Filol, and on and on.
Yeah, there was a lot of tension for this game. People kind of realized it was really deciding the World Cup winner at that point. And the Argentinian supporters were making a lot of noise outside the hotel where the Brazilian delegation was. It was a very tough, very rough game, negative
Yes,
game in all sense.
a lot of kicking and punching on that day.
Yeah,
And so eventually scoreless tie. You have the following lineup for Brazil: Leao, Toninho, Oscar, Amaral, Rodriguez Neto. He's replaced by Edinho in the 34th minute after an injury.
yeah.
Chicao, Batista, Gil, Jorge Mendonça. He'd be replaced by Zico in the 67th minute. Roberto Dinamite and Dircio.
And
Dircio
Rivelino was injured at that point.
injured or out of the team. Which one was it, you think?
I remember him doing physical treatment for some kind of injury he had. There was a lot of controversy about whether he should be played or not, but for that specific game, he was not in good physical condition anyway.
Incidentally, Dircio turned 26 on the day of the match, and on the same day, his wife gave birth to his son in Rio. But all in all, as far as this match, it was a bruising encounter, a lot of physical rough play.
Yeah, totally negative game here on both sides. One thing that I remember is that the Brazil technical coaching staff, they made the Brazilian players go out on the pitch a long time before the game because they knew that the Argentinian crowd was going to whistle, boo the players, and they wanted the players to that
Oh, I
atmosphere
see, I see. Yeah, to absorb
before
it
the
and
game.
yeah, not let
It
them
was
face
kind
it.
of absorb that
Yeah.
atmosphere and be able to play inside that bad atmosphere in the game.
I imagine at that time it was looked upon as a diplomatic tie that still kept the chances of each respective team going into the next round at that point.
Yeah, both teams kept their hopes alive. But
Right.
then there would be the great, great
Yeah.
problem with the merger next.
Yes. So on that day, that June 21st, 1978, last round of matches in this World Cup. First, Brazil at Mendoza, they faced Poland. Brazil would win this match 3-1. We have the following lineup: Leao, Nelinho, Oscar, Amaral, Toninho, Batista, Toninho Cerezo. Rivellino would replace him in the 77th
Yeah.
minute. Gil, Zico. Zico would be injured early in the match and replaced by Jorge Mendonça in the 7th minute. Roberto Dinamite and Dircio. Brazil would win 3-1. In the 12th minute, Nelinho scored from a free kick. Poland would tie the match in the 45th minute through Gersgård's Lato. In the 57th minute, Brazil would take the lead through Roberto Dinamite. A shot from a Brazilian struck the post, and Roberto Dinamite scored from the rebound. And in the 63rd minute, Roberto Dinamite would score the third goal.
Actually, Shan, the second goal by Roberto Dinamite, if I remember well, Brazil struck the post 3 times
Yes,
before
yes,
Roberto Dinamite
yes,
eventually scored.
yes, indeed. Yeah. So it was a sequence that, yeah, it involved three shots at the bar that hit the bar and the post, and finally Roberto Dinamite knocked in the rebound. So Brazil won 3-1. Of course, we know what happens next with Argentina and Peru. This is the never ending debate whether there was collusion or not. And after almost 50 years, I imagine this debate will never subside.
Yeah, yeah. This is the famous incident about Henry Kissinger visiting the Peruvian dressing room in the company of Jorge Rafael Videla. As you said, 47 years ago, right? Okay, yeah.
Brazil were now to play in the third place match along with Italy. And in their group, the Netherlands had qualified to the final.
If I remember well, there was an appeal by the Brazilian Federation at the time when they knew they were going to play Poland in the afternoon and Argentina would play Peru in the evening. Brazil made an appeal to FIFA. And the FIFA, who was presided by a Brazilian, João Avelange, denied the appeal. Just a remark.
It's because of this match and the shame of Gijón in the next World Cup in 1982 between Germany and Austria that this rule was made that on the final day, all the teams have to play simultaneously.
Same time,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For this third place match against Italy, it's on June 24th, the day before the World Cup final. It's at Buenos Aires at the El Monumental. This is the Italy of some of the players who would win the 1982 World Cup, managed by Enzo Bearzot. We had the
Yeah.
likes of Dino Zoff, Cabrini, Gentile, Scirea, Paolo Rossi, Antonioni, among others.
Yeah. Paulo Rossi, who would eventually destroy Brazil in
Of course,
1982.
yeah. For this match, this third place match, we have the following lineup: Leao in goal, captain of the team, Nelinho, Oscar, Amaral, Rodriguez Neto, Batista, Toninho Cerezo. He'd be replaced by Rivellino in the 64th minute, his final appearance for Brazil. Gil, he'd be replaced by Reinaldo in the 46th minute. Jorge Mendonça, Roberto Dinamite, and Dirceu.
Yeah. Reinaldo eventually reappeared for Brazil in that game, but only as a substitute, as you said.
Italy would take the lead in the first half through Franco Causio when he headed in Paolo Rossi's cross on the right side. Brazil would come back in the second half. And in the 64th minute, you have the much referenced curving shot by Nelinho. So Roberto Dinamite passed to Nelinho on the right wing, and from outside of the box, he bent his long range shot past Dino Zoff. It's a very beautiful goal.
Yeah, yeah, no, I must say it was not strange for the Leon to score a goal like that. He was well known for his ability of shooting and scoring with the outside of his foot. And we talked a few moments ago about the game versus Sweden when he was preparing to take the corner kick exactly like that, like he used to bend the ball. And he bent the ball against Italy that they exactly like it was a very beautiful goal. Zoff, right to the Italian keeper, was just amazed. There was nothing he could do.
Brazil would win the match in the 72nd minute. A cross from the left side was headed back by Mendoza and volleyed by Dirceu from outside of the box. Brazil won 2-1 and finished as third place. And you already mentioned that Coutinho declared Brazil as the moral victors because, in addition to the situation with Peru match, they had finished the World Cup undefeated.
Undefeated. The only team that was
Right.
undefeated in that World Cup.
Let's look at the aftermath. Who were made to be the scapegoats?
The team, the whole team and Coutinho, but Coutinho eventually would resurface as a good coach for Flamengo. He would make Flamengo win the Carioca Championship, which is the Rio de Janeiro Championship. Then eventually he went to coach abroad in the United States, the Los Angeles Aztecs, if my memory serves me well. I think the blame was kind of divided between the players and the coach. And strangely enough, Admiral Heleno Nunes was not subjected to much criticism, even though there was clearly his interference in the team affairs at that time. It was the fact that he was an admiral in the Navy, he was connected to the powers that were ruling Brazil at that time under a military dictatorship. It was what they called the dark ages of Brazilian politics at that time.
In your role as a journalist, did you second guess the decisions like not to call up Falcao or other technical players?
Oh yeah, not only me, many other people, criticized the choice because the difference in technical level between Falcão and Chicão was abysmal. That was the way Claudio Coutinho wanted at that time.
Circling back to the Rivellino situation, it's still unclear when you read reports whether he was injured or whether he was dropped. According to Rivellino, he said he was injured and he was friends with Coutinho afterwards, but it's really unclear as to what really happened.
As I said, I remember seeing Rivellino undergoing a physical treatment in the Brazilian camp at the time. I think it was a little bit of, one side and the other side, a little bit of both, 50-50, I would say. Actually, this brings me to memory to mention something. In that World Cup, there was a player in the Argentinian squad that was eventually dropped called Maradona. I remember the year before, I saw a game on the television, Argentina playing Hungary. And the
Yeah, that
coach,
was his debut. Yeah.
in the second half, brought in this little Bibi, as they call them in Argentina, the little boy, to play. And I was in Brazil watching television, and I was amazed at the skill of that very young player. And everybody, my goodness, everybody was saying, what a good player this is. And he was in the squad, but eventually he was dropped. He stayed with Argentina. I remember watching Maradona taking part in the training, in the practices of Argentina, but not being part of the Argentina squad. And a funny thing is that Maradona always said that his greatest idol in football, more than Pelé, more than anybody else, was Rivellino.
Yes.
He was a great admirer of Rivellino. But Rivellino, even though very skillful, technically brilliant, was never a leader of a team, the way, say, Pelé was, the way that Gerson was. He never asserted himself as a leader in the team. And maybe this led him to eventually be dropped by Coutinho, apart from his physical problems. Maybe, I don't know.
Despite not being a memorable World Cup, it was beneficial for the likes of Dirceu and maybe Nelinho. Are these players remembered mostly for this tournament?
I think that, especially Nelinho, I think, more than Dirceu. Dirceu was also very important, but Nelinho, apart from that, I wouldn't mention anybody else. Toninho Cerezo was coming up, but mostly Nelinho, I think.
As far as Dirceu, he made his way to Mexico and then eventually to Italy, where he played for a number of teams, and even Atletico Madrid, I think, for a short spell, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, he was a very useful player. He was technically very good, but especially because of his stamina. He used to cover a lot of ground. Eventually, he was killed in a car accident in
Oh,
Rio.
yes, in 1995. That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. What were the lessons learned from this yet another relative failure? How would you compare and contrast with 1974?
The lessons would be learned for the next World Cup in 1982. And eventually what happened is that Admiral Heleno Nunes was let go, was replaced by Julito Coutinho, who was a businessman. And Julito Coutinho brought Tele Santana into the team. And tactically, Brazil totally changed. So all the ideas about fitness, about stamina, about the strength, physical strength, all this was dropped in favor of brilliance, which was what characterized the Brazilian team in 1982 World Cup under Tele Santana. This 1982 team is still considered one of the best of Brazil in all times. But eventually they would, as I said before, they would lose tragically today to Italy with 3 goals scored by Paulo Rossi, a player who could not even have been in the Azzurra, the Italian squad, for the World Cup because he had been suspended before because of a betting scandal. I don't know whether you remember that. Eventually, they allowed him to play, and he, by himself, defeated Brazil in that game.
As a journalist, you're watching all this, you're seeing a second World Cup where it's very defensive minded. Were you yourself as one of the people who clamored to return to more attacking style of football?
Yes, I was, because I always liked Tele Santana. Tele Santana lost the World Cup in 1982, then he would lose that quarterfinal game versus France in 1986, a very controversial game also because of that penalty kick that hit the post, hit the back of the goalkeeper, went in. But anyway, eventually he would redeem himself by winning with São Paulo Football Club.
Oh, yes.
Club World Championships. He was a brilliant coach, a man of great ideas about football. I think it was a tragedy for Brazil that he never won a World Cup with the Brazilian team.
In closing, how is this World Cup looked upon by Brazil football historians? It's not a memorable one, but there were the debuts of Zico, Cerezo, Oscar, and Edinho, who would be part of Tele Santana's wonderful 1982 side.
Yeah, it was a time of change for Brazil. This is the contrast between 1970. People never really very confident about Brazil in 1978, not just because of the team limitations, but also because they always suspected that the World Cup in Argentina would eventually have to be won by Argentina. People in Brazil always thought that there would be some arrangements that would benefit Argentina. There has always been a big rivalry between Brazil and Argentina in terms of football. And things totally changed after that. As I said, with the dismissal of Heleno Nunes as head of the federation, with the arrival of Julito Coutinho, and the arrival of Tele Santana as coach. It was a total change, 100% change in Brazilian football.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. All our contact information is listed on the blog and podcast upload. So, José Inácio, thank you very much,
You're welcome, Sham.
and hope to continue these discussions on Brazil football history.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.